Welcome to week 3 of 6 talks on the 1960s. The full schedule, the rest of it is in the monthly calendar. It starts to get a little weird at this point, so next week we're not here on Thursday, we're here next Wednesday. So next Wednesday at 2 will be the class number 4. And there's a machine driving down the hall. That's cool. And then the following week, the class 5 is on that Monday, and then the final class is on that Thursday leading. So but check the calendar, and I'll make another announcement at the end of today's class. Yeah, I think what I figured I'd do with that, class 5 is on Monday, December 15th, which happens to be my birthday. So in honor of I think the papers are due in honor of my birthday, so bring them in. Pick it, whatever topic you feel like, just make sure the footnotes are in the proper form. And no ChatGPT writing the papers, okay? Can you imagine teaching today when the computers can write everything? I mean, I cannot imagine how you handle reading that stuff and knowing whether it's legit or not. Okay, well, let's get started. That clock's a little slow. Today's class, I want to talk about the Vietnam War. And the first thing I want to do is, and I'm pretty sure there are some men in this room who served in Vietnam, and I really like to honor anybody who would want to put their hand up and say they were there, because there's one gentleman, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think. Thank you for that service. What a thankless job that was. And you think about how veterans of other wars have come back to parades and welcoming back, but the guys who came back from that war, what abuse from so many Americans who shouldn't. And I opposed the war a lot back then, but still, those soldiers deserve better than what they got when they got home. And so thank you, really. Okay, so to talk about the Vietnam, I want to start with trying to put it in context. In hindsight, it looks like such a terrible mistake. Like, how could they possibly have done that? How stupid could they have been? But in context, it made sense at the time to a lot of people who, the people making the decisions, but a lot of ordinary Americans as well. So to try to explain that context, I want to start by talking about the Cold War. And so let's take a time machine, go back to right at the end of World War II. The United States dominated the world economically in a way that no other country ever has in the history of the planet, really. At the end of the war, the United States, just by ourselves, 2/3 of the world's gold. It's hard to believe now, but the United States was responsible for 2/3 of the oil production on the planet. There was no OPEC back then. It was Texas and Oklahoma producing vast amounts of oil. America had half of the monetary reserves in the world, half the manufacturing capacity, half the electrical output. Truly, the United States was the global superpower. The odd thing is that Americans didn't have a very long time to enjoy being number one in the world. Very quickly, they found themselves facing what seemed like a mortal challenge in the form of the Soviet Union. So if you remember, the communists had taken power in Russia back in 1917. During World War II, the American media and President Roosevelt praised the Soviet Union, praised Stalin, made a lot about how wonderful the Russian people were. But the rhetoric changed as soon as, shortly after the war ended. When Winston Churchill came to visit America in March of 1946, he gave a famous speech out in Missouri with President Truman in attendance. And as part of that speech, Churchill announced that from the Baltic to the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And he was right. At the end of the war, the Soviet army occupied Eastern Germany, occupied most of the countries in Eastern Europe, and over the next several years, communists took control of Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Yugoslavia also had a communist government, although it was technically independent of the Soviets. But in each of those countries, the communists rigged elections, outlawed opposing parties, and socialized industry, and turned Eastern Europe into their own economic zone. In 1949, the Senate ratified the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You remember George Washington, on his way out the door, way back in 1796, warned America against ever getting pulled into alliances with other countries. NATO in 1949 was the first peacetime alliance America had ever entered into. But the world seemed different, and America created NATO. All the countries in blue on that map were members of NATO. The Russians countered with what they called the Warsaw Pact, naturally the countries in red on that map. A few countries in Europe remain non-aligned. They're in green on the map. And the world was beginning to look like it was split into two opposing camps. President Harry Truman, in March 1947, made that explicit in a speech to Congress. At the time, after the war, Great Britain had been providing economic and military assistance to the governments of Greece and Turkey, which were facing communist parties in their country that seemed to be growing in power. In 1947, Britain signaled to Truman that they couldn't afford it any longer. Great Britain was pretty much bankrupt after the war. So Truman went to Congress and asked for $400 million to help prop up the governments in Greece and Turkey. And he didn't just ask them for help in that context. He delivered really the first big public statement defining the world as a division between good and evil. And as he put it, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." And so Truman offered American economic and military aid to any country that was resisting communism. A few months later, in a commencement speech at Harvard delivered by Secretary of State George Marshall, the United States offered an invitation to the countries of Europe to ask for American help to rebuild after the war. The government had two reasons for the Marshall Plan. Partly it was definitely to prevent communism from getting stronger, and partly was that we realized unless Europe rebuilt, they wouldn't be in a position to buy American goods, and the American economy was going to depend in part on foreign trade. So over the course of the next 5 years, Congress approved $13 billion to help Europe rebuild. On the photo there at the top, that is, in the center of that photo at the top is George Marshall waiting for his turn to talk at the Harvard commencement. You might recognize a couple of the other faces on that slide. The fellow on the far left, anybody recognize J. Robert Oppenheimer? He was also being honored at that commencement. And the rather disgruntled-looking fellow on the far right with the mortarboard, that is the poet T.S. Eliot. And I don't know why. He doesn't look happy. I'm not sure why. Although if you read his poetry, the guy may never have been happy, so it's unclear. But it's a great photo. Another thing that Congress did in 1947, beside approving the Marshall Plan, it passed the National Security Act, which merged the Army Department and the Navy Department. It merged them into the new Department of Defense. It created a National Security Council to advise the President, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency to gather intelligence and to engage in covert activities. In 1949, Americans suffered three emotional and political shocks in connection with the Cold War. First, it turned out that the Soviets had managed to develop the atomic bomb. And the conventional wisdom in America was that it was going to take the Soviets a whole lot longer to catch up with an atomic bomb. But they tested one in 1949. Truman immediately approved plans for America to develop the next stage of killing machines, the hydrogen bomb. A lot of scientists, including Einstein, urged the government not to do it because hydrogen bombs could kill millions of people at once. But Truman approved the project because he knew the Soviets were going to be trying to do it too. A few months later, the communists took power in China. The United States had supplied Chiang Kai-shek's government with about $2 billion of military aid over the last couple of decades, but that didn't stop the communists from taking power. Republicans in Congress promptly blamed the Democrats for somehow losing China, as if it was ours to lose. But it was the idea that China had gone communist while the Democrats were in power was a very potent political argument. And then a few months later, it turned out that there was espionage going on in the American atomic program. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested for selling atomic secrets to the Soviets. They were convicted in 1951 and executed in 1953. So the Cold War, which is, the tensions are building, and it's now clear that the Soviets also have atomic power. The Cold War gets hot in 1950 when South Korea was invaded by North Korea. At the end of the war, there had been a division between a pro-communist government in the north, a pro-Western government in the south. The North Koreans apparently assumed that they could conquer the South and that America wouldn't care. When they invaded, Truman went to the Security Council at the UN, which approved the use of force to defend South Korea. Truman sent a couple of army divisions to Korea under General MacArthur. MacArthur was able to drive the North Koreans back across the boundary line, about the halfway point. And then the big question was, all right, we've gotten rid of the North Koreans in the South. Maybe we should just keep on going and unify the entire peninsula of Korea. MacArthur assured Truman, no problem, we can go all the way back up, the Chinese won't bother us, they're not going to get involved, and if they do get involved, it'll be easy to beat them. So MacArthur led the forces all the way up to the Yalu River, which is the border between the Korean peninsula and China. At which point, 250,000 Chinese troops charged across the Yalu River and promptly drove the Americans all the way back down to the zone in the middle and even further south. The fighting went on for 2 more years, back and forth across the middle of the peninsula. Finally, after Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, with a pledge that he would visit Korea and try to figure out how to resolve things, he won, he went to Korea, and they worked out an armistice that basically restored the status quo. The border is still roughly where it's shown on that map. Now, how did Eisenhower propose to fight the Cold War? His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, announced the policy of massive retaliation. Basically, the United States and its allies are going to respond to any Soviet attack by using atomic weapons. The logic behind this was that the Soviets had a much larger ground army. They could put a lot more men in uniform than we could, but we had more bombs. We had jet bombers that could drop them. We were developing missiles that could launch them. And so the idea was, you can't mess with us because if you do, we're going to end up dropping the big one on you. The policy of massive retaliation became known in the media as more bang for the buck. And at the end of the 50s, there was a third way to send bombs to Russia through atomic submarines, the Polaris missiles launched from submarines. So one way that Eisenhower fought the Cold War was by threatening atomic war if the Soviets got out of line. But that wasn't the only way you could fight the Cold War. And as communism and nationalism was spreading in parts of the Third World, we relied to some extent on the CIA. And in the three most notable events in the 50s involving the CIA, a nationalist government took over Iran in 1951 and seized the oil facilities in Iran, which at that point were controlled by Great Britain. The CIA funded a coup by the military that put the Shah of Iran on the throne. The Shah of Iran then rewarded America with a 40% interest in Iranian oil. So it was a good deal for the U.S. and for the Shah. A couple years later, a nationalist government in Guatemala expropriated all the United Fruit plantations in order to distribute land to the peasants. The CIA aided a rebellion against that government. And then a few years later, in Laos, the CIA helped overthrow a coalition government that included the local Communist Party. So one way to fight the Cold War is behind the scenes using the CIA. Now, one of the focal points, or one of the places people were worried about in the 50s in the Cold War, was Southeast Asia. After Japan was defeated, the French reasserted control. That region on the map had been a French colony before the war. After the Japanese were ousted, the French moved back in. There were a lot of people living in that part of the world who, having fought the Japanese, were not at all excited about having the French come back and take charge. And so there were nationalist movements in those countries in Southeast Asia. The most prominent of the leaders was a fellow named Ho Chi Minh. He was born in Vietnam. His father was a Confucian scholar. As a young man, he traveled the world working on a French steamship. For a time, he actually came to the United States. Would you believe that Ho Chi Minh worked as a baker at the Parker Street Hotel in downtown Boston? But he did. After that, he then traveled to Moscow, where he learned about how to fight an independence war from the Soviets. He returned to Vietnam in 1941 and led guerrilla forces fighting the Japanese. When the war ended, Ho Chi Minh declared independence on behalf of the Vietnamese people. And he plagiarized. This is what Ho Chi Minh wrote. All people are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He keeps going. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means that all the peoples of the earth are equal from birth. All peoples have a right to live, to be happy, to be free. Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact, it is so already. Ho Chi Minh asked Truman for support to help with their, help them become the kind of independent country that America was. Truman ignored him. So the fighting in Southeast Asia to kick out the French lasted for several years. The French, who also were having economic trouble after the war, they depended on American military aid to help them stay in power. By 1954, America had provided the French with almost $3 billion of military aid to protect their colonies. Nevertheless, in 1954, the French army was surrounded at a village in northern Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu. They kind of stumbled into a outpost where suddenly they were surrounded in this valley. They couldn't get out. The French asked the United States for help. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended we send in American planes, American troops, and tactical nuclear weapons. You can always count on the Joint Chiefs of Staff for bold and creative leadership and ideas there. So they wanted to bomb the place with nuclear weapons. Eisenhower said to them, "You boys must be crazy. We can't use those awful things against Asians for the second time in 10 years. My God." Someone with Eisenhower's experience could say no to the Joint Chiefs. And, so with that, we didn't send in the troops, we didn't send in the bombers, and without rescue from the United States, the French army surrendered. So there was an international conference in Geneva in 1954. The United States was there, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China. They adopted something they called accords, dividing Vietnam at the 17th parallel. So you would have a communist part in the north, a non-communist part in the south. The accords provided for free elections in 1956. And the idea was, we'll let the Vietnamese people vote, and if it ends up that they want to unify the country in 1956, so be it. That's what the Geneva Accords said. They also provided that nobody, no major power like the Soviet Union or the US, was going to be supplying military equipment to the two parts of Vietnam. You can imagine that neither the Russians nor the Americans honored that part of the agreement. After the French left, the leader in South Vietnam was a man named Ngo, I cannot pronounce that word, Ngo Dinh Diem. He had been educated in French schools. He was fiercely anti-communist. In 1955, the CIA helped Diem. They were having a referendum on Diem's government, and thanks to the CIA, Diem got 98% of the vote. Between 1955 and 1961, the United States provided $1.5 billion of economic and military aid to Diem's government. That was the fifth largest total of any country in the world. Getting American support, and that wasn't bad for a country that was only about the size of Florida. Vietnam's not that big a place. All right, so that takes us through the 50s. When John Kennedy was elected in 1960, the Cold War was at its height, and Kennedy's inaugural speech is one of the best examples of Cold War rhetoric you could possibly ask for. So here's sort of the highlight of it, and we'll see if the sound works.
The word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
That's pretty ambitious, right? The United States will do whatever it takes to protect the free world. I mean, the world is now good or evil, free or unfree, and we are responsible for protecting the free world, and we will pay whatever that price is. That was a really popular speech. I mean, it's like a different world to our minds today, I suspect, but that was the mindset, that communism is a threat to the free peoples of the world. Anywhere in the world, we have to be prepared to meet that threat. And that view of the world made sense in 1961 to most people in the United States. Now, Kennedy immediately ran into some trouble in trying to fulfill America's part in fighting the Cold War. The poor guy inherited plans to invade Cuba. If you may remember, Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in 1959 by ousting a military dictator named Batista. Castro actually came to the United States and was wined and dined for a little while after his revolution, but he soon began taking military aid and economic aid from the Soviets. So Eisenhower approved CIA plans for an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro Cubans. Kennedy comes in, his advisors explain the CIA plan to him. His advisors assure him that the Cuban people will rise up to resist Castro as soon as the invaders land. So American ships escorted the invasion fleet, and absolutely everything went wrong. There weren't enough invaders. The Cubans knew they were coming, And the Cuban people were kind of enthusiastic about Castro at the time and not at all willing to rise and overthrow him. When things started to go bad, Kennedy refused to send in American planes or troops. And instead, the invasion fizzled, the guys were all rounded up, and it was a huge public relations disaster. One of Kennedy's responses was, how could I have been so stupid as to believe my advisors? I mean, really, like, these guys think they know what they're talking about, but I can't trust them because they don't. Later, in 1961, the Cold War takes on a new sort of physical form in Germany when the Soviet troops started building a wall around West Berlin and along the German border. Up until the wall, East Germans were bailing out on East Germany at the rate of about 1,000 a day. East Germans were filtering across the border into West Berlin, and the Soviets decided they had to do something, and after a day in which about 2,000 people escaped in one day, the Soviets started bulldozing and putting up barriers. Fortunately, they did not prevent Americans from continuing to drive through East Germany to bring supplies to West Berlin. The scariest moment of the Cold War happened in 1962 when an American spy plane came up with photos of Cuba showing that the Soviets were installing missile sites and launchers. There's a couple of the photos, the U-2 photos there on the slide. I mean, I look at that and I have no idea what I'm looking at. But apparently, if you know what you're looking at, that's dangerous stuff because it looks like they're building silos and they've got missile launchers. The missiles had a range of about 1,000 miles, so they could hit a whole good chunk of the southeast United States. Naturally, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to invade Cuba, but Kennedy instead, after round-the-clock sessions with his advisors, this time around they came up with a plan for what they called a quarantine. American ships were going to prevent all further Soviet ships from supplying Cuba. So Kennedy went on TV, he announced the quarantine, and he also warned that any strike from one of those missiles in Cuba anywhere in the Western Hemisphere would be treated as an attack by the Soviet Union and we would respond in full. Basically, what made that so scary is that a trigger-happy Soviet officer on Cuba could have pushed a button and started World War III. It really could have happened. But fortunately, the Soviet ships turned around. They didn't cross the blockade. The United States made a public promise not to invade Cuba. The Soviets made a public promise to remove the missiles. Kennedy also made a secret promise to remove missiles from Turkey. And remember, the United States had missiles right next to the Soviet Union that could hit the Soviet Union. But somehow when the Soviet Union puts missiles near us that could hit us, that's terrible. There's not a lot of consistency in some of this. But to try to help smooth things out, Kennedy removed some of the missiles that were located in Turkey. His approval rating went up to 77%. Kennedy's handling of this really impressed a lot of people. Okay, so what about turning our attention back to Southeast Asia? At this point in the early 60s, there's a map. You have, it's not a very large part of the world. It's not rich in natural resources. It's mainly a good place to grow rice. But anywhere in the world was considered a vital part of the struggle against communism. And what was going on in Southeast Asia, you had a fellow named Prince Sihanouk ruling Cambodia, and he managed to stay in power partly by making a deal with the communists that they could use Cambodia as a way to send supplies from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam. So he kind of made a deal with them. And then there were civil wars going on in Laos and in Vietnam between communist forces and non-communist forces. So what was the U.S. doing in the early 60s? We were pursuing two strategies in Vietnam. One had the fancy label counterinsurgency. And the idea was American planes, American helicopters, and American advisors are going to go out in the field and accompany the South Vietnamese army and help guide them to fight better. When Kennedy became president, the United States had about 1,000 advisors. By the end of 1963, we had 6,000 advisors. When they went out in combat, some of them got killed, and by the end of 1963, the total deaths American deaths had reached about 200. But the simple fact was American advisors couldn't help the South Vietnamese army fight a whole lot better because the South Vietnamese army wasn't really very good or very committed to the cause. The second part of American strategy, beside counterinsurgency, was to support something known as the Strategic Hamlet Program. And the idea was the communists are infiltrating villages and encouraging the peasants to come over onto their side. And so what do? You move the peasants into armed villages, and you put up barriers around the villages, and you sort of protect the peasants behind these bamboo fences. And the idea was you create fortified villages and protect the peasants from being subverted by communists. The trouble was the peasants hated the idea. It moved them from their ancestral villages. It took them away from the land where their ancestors were buried, and it didn't include any form of land reform. And a lot of the peasants had little land and definitely would have preferred to have more. So the counterinsurgency wasn't working too well because the South Vietnamese army wasn't too good, and the Strategic Hamlet Program wasn't really preventing many peasants from deciding they'd get a better deal from the communists than they were getting from the Diem government. And there were additional problems for the Diem government. Come here, you. Diem and his advisors were Catholic, educated in French schools, Catholic. Most of the Vietnamese people, though, were Buddhist. And a protest movement led by Buddhist monks developed in South Vietnam in 1962 and 1963. When the army tried to crack down on the protests, a few Buddhist monks decided to set themselves on fire in protest. There's a photo of one of them there on the slide. So it was appearing that the Diem's government was losing its grip on keeping order in South Vietnam. Now, a lot of historians and other commentators have speculated about whether John Kennedy would have ended up escalating in Vietnam the way Lyndon Johnson did. And, they really just turned on the air conditioner, didn't they? Okay, we'll see how that works. One of the bits of evidence that people look at and ponder about was an interview that Kennedy gave to Walter Cronkite in September 1963. Because Kennedy said to Cronkite about South Vietnam, in the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who will have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists. Based on advice from that the Diem government was losing its grip, as I mentioned, Kennedy and the State Department, the American ambassador in Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, signaled to Kennedy and the State Department that he sort of thought a new regime in South Vietnam might do better than Diem was. So the State Department signaled to Lodge, we wouldn't really be too upset if there was a military coup and someone got rid of Diem. So in November 1963, the South Vietnamese military overthrew the Diem government. Diem and his brother were killed. This is one of those careful what you wish for departments, because after the coup, you didn't get a better government. You got a series of unstable military regimes. All right, so when Lyndon Johnson took over here's where things stood in early 1964. By now, the U.S. had about 17,000 advisors. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told Johnson that the communists in the South, known as the Viet Cong, they controlled about 40% of South Vietnam. and in some provinces they controlled about 90%. And the North Vietnamese were sending their own army to fight in the south. Some of them snuck through the demilitarized zone, and others went through Cambodia along that pathway that's shown on the map in red that became nicknamed the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So the North Vietnamese army is coming down using Cambodia as a route to get into the south. Johnson wanted to ignore Vietnam as much as he could leading up to the election in 1964. But events forced his hand, and he took advantage in August of 1964 with the Tonkin Gulf incident. So here's what was happening. The U.S. Navy was helping the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese were raiding the coast of North Vietnam to cause, to blow up things and cause mischief. The U.S. Navy was helping them get to the North Vietnamese coast. And on August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats fired on a USS destroyer, the Maddox. A couple days later, the Maddox reported that it had been attacked again. They never actually saw any enemy ships the second time around, and it's not clear that the second attack ever happened, but it was reported, and Johnson used the information. So what happened? Johnson, as soon as the American ship was attacked, Johnson ordered some airstrikes on a couple of locations on the coast. And McNamara, there he is with his chart, goes to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he lies to them. McNamara concealed where the Maddox was, denied that the Maddox had been involved in anything to do with what the South Vietnamese were doing. Direct quote, "Our Navy played no part in, was not associated with, was not aware of any South Vietnamese actions, even if there were any." Since the Maddox was like ferrying people up to the North Vietnamese coast, that was a lie. And the map, and it's really hard to see on that chart, but if you looked carefully at where it actually happened and where the Maddox really was, compared to where McNamara shows it on his little map at the Senate, he has sanitized it to make it look like the Maddox is just sailing around in international waters when it's, suffers an unprovoked attack. Johnson used the incident to ask Congress basically for a blank check, to give him the authority to strike back as necessary. And on August 7th, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. As you can see from the slide, the margins were pretty overwhelming. Congress was quite ready to do what Johnson asked. And what the Tonkin Gulf Resolution says is that the President can take all necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Now that's pretty open-ended. During the campaign, Johnson tried to downplay the potential for escalation in Vietnam, and he went so far as to say, "We don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. We don't want to get tied down in a land war in Asia." But while Johnson was saying that on the campaign trail, the U.S. military was developing plans for bombing campaigns and the use of American ground troops. They were planning to do exactly what Johnson was telling the voters we weren't planning to do. After the election in 1964, the situation in Vietnam got worse. Here are the people who were giving Johnson advice. Secretary of State at the time was Dean Rusk, who had been the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. The Secretary of Defense was Robert McNamara. He had been the president of Ford Motor Company. The National Security Advisor was McGeorge Bundy, who had taught the history of U.S. foreign policy at Harvard. Our American ambassador to South Vietnam was General Maxwell Taylor. The commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam was General William Westmoreland. And where did things stand in early '65? The CIA estimated that the Viet Cong had about 50,000 full-time soldiers and another 100,000 people who helped them out part-time. Nobody knew how many soldiers the North Vietnamese had smuggled into the South. The South Vietnamese technically had a really large army. it just wasn't all that effective. And at that point, the U.S. had about 28,000 soldiers. Johnson was getting conflicting advice. When his security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, went to Vietnam and came back, Bundy reported, "The situation in Vietnam is deteriorating, and without new U.S. action, defeat appears inevitable, probably within the next year or so. There is still time to turn it around, but not much." On the other hand, Ambassador General Maxwell Taylor expressed what he called grave reservations about the idea of sending U.S. ground troops. But Taylor warned, basically, if you send in ground troops, you're going to make the same mistake the French made. You aren't going to be able to win, you're going to end up being driven out. In early February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked an American Air Force base called Camp Holloway near a village called Pleiku. 8 U.S. soldiers were killed, 125 were wounded. The next day, Johnson ordered bombing of Viet Cong staging areas just north of the demilitarized zone. The attack at Pleiku is kind of the trigger. I mean, they were already talking about it, but the attack at Pleiku and then this bombing is the trigger that starts pushing them more and more down the road to escalation. In early March, Johnson authorized round-the-clock bombing, what the military called Operation Rolling Thunder. The idea was if you drop enough bombs on the North Vietnamese, you will discourage them from supporting communist activity in Laos and South Vietnam. You will also make it harder for them to wage war by blowing up their industrial capacity. So they bombed bridges, they bombed rail yards, docks, barracks, supply dumps. They also tried to target routes through the DMZ that were used for infiltration. To avoid the mistake that MacArthur had made in Korea, they carefully didn't bomb near the Chinese border. That's what that yellowish, or whatever that color is, orange? That orange zone along the top of the map. They didn't bomb up there because they were afraid it might trigger the Chinese to get involved. The bombing lasted pretty much with only minor interruptions all the way till November 1968. Totally, the American planes launched about 300,000 attacks, dropped nearly 650,000 tons of bombs, and lost 900 American planes. In the spring of 1965, Johnson knew he faced a really, really difficult choice. He told one of his best friends from the Senate, Senator Richard Russell, "The great trouble I'm under is that a man can fight if he sees daylight down the road somewhere, but there ain't no daylight in Vietnam." And he told Russell what he worried is he could not have both, quote, and this is his quote, "the woman I really loved, the Great Society," that we talked about last week, he couldn't have the woman I really loved and also that bitch of a war on the other side of the world. He wanted the Great Society. He was pulled he felt he needed the bitch of a war on the other side of the world. And the day that he expressed those doubts to Senator Russell, he also authorized the Marines. 3,500 Marines landed on March 8th, 1965 to protect the U.S. Air Base at Da Nang. It was the first use of U.S. ground troops as opposed to the advisors that we'd been using till then. General Westmoreland wanted no publicity at all when the Marines landed. But it turned out there were sightseers, the South Vietnamese soldiers, there were girls wearing flowered leis, and American soldiers with a big sign that said, "Welcome, gallant Marines." So much for no publicity. The next day, Johnson authorized the use of napalm. Napalm had been developed by Dow Chemical, which at the time among Americans was best known for making saran wrap. But Dow Chemical is a pretty versatile place, and they also made napalm. Napalm can create firestorms with winds over 70 miles an hour. During the war, the United States dropped 400,000 tons of napalm. They destroyed 10,000 square miles of forest. And they set people on fire and burned people, as you can see from some of that photo in the upper left is one of the most famous photos from the Vietnam era. That little girl has been napalmed. You can see her skin peeling on the photo on the bottom. On April 1st, Johnson authorized the use of U.S. soldiers in combat. By the summer of 1965, there were 75,000 troops there. On July 21st, Johnson held a big meeting at the White House with all of his advisors to talk about what to do now. McNamara predicted disaster if the United States didn't escalate. This is from McNamara. The situation in South Vietnam is worse than a year ago, when it was worse than a year before that. The government is able to provide security to fewer and fewer people in less and less territory. The odds are less than 50-50 that the current military government will last out the year. So McNamara identified three options, and you can see that he stacked the deck. One option was to cut our losses and withdraw under the best conditions we can get, which, according to McNamara, would be conditions humiliating the United States and damaging our future effectiveness on the world scene. The logic here is if we don't stick it out in Vietnam and prove that we're willing to pay any price, the rest of the world won't believe us about our commitment to protect them. A lot of this was about credibility, that we've made a commitment to fight communism, and if we don't do it here, people won't believe we'll do it anywhere. McNamara's second option was to just keep things as they are, but he said that would almost certainly just force us to choose later whether to withdraw or accelerate. And then his third option was escalate. This will stave off defeat in the short run and offer a good chance of a favorable settlement in the long run, but it would imply a commitment to a fighting war at considerable cost and casualties. There's an understatement. There was Undersecretary of State George Ball, and he happens to be the man in with the gray-haired man in the very center of that photo next to Dean Rusk. George Ball said at this meeting, we should just let the South Vietnamese government do what it seems to do best, which is fall apart. And he predicted defeat. If we go in there, we double our bet and we get lost in the rice paddies. One general said that victory in Vietnam would take 5 years and 500,000 men. A few days later, Johnson went on TV to announce that he was going to escalate. I have asked General Westmoreland what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me we will meet his needs. I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle. I think I know, too, how their mothers weep and how their families sorrow. This is the most agonizing and the most painful duty of your president. The guy was really sincere. He really hated that choice, but felt that he had to do it. So he committed to 50,000 more men right away, with more to come later in the year. The Army was going to have to start drafting 35,000 men a month. And he told a reporter, I don't believe I can walk out. If I did, they'd take Thailand. They'd take Cambodia. They'd take Burma. They'd take Indonesia. They'd take India. They'd come right back and take the Philippines. I'd be another Neville Chamberlain, and we'd have another Munich. And if you remember, Munich on the eve of World War II, when Britain and France rolled over and let Hitler have what he wanted because they were so afraid of a war, the idea that we're not going to have another Munich was burned into the mentality of people making decisions in the 50s and 60s. Now, what was known as the domino theory, the idea if we lose South Vietnam, every single other one of those countries on the map, as far as India and as far as the Philippines, they're all going to go. That looks pretty naive and kind of, are you kidding me? Today, but an awful lot of people really believed that at the time. And, we know how things turned out, but remember, the world did seem to be a struggle between good and evil, and Johnson really felt like he had no choice. It's the guy's a tragedy because he just wanted the Great Society. He didn't want this, but he made the mistake and we went there anyway. So, by the end of the year, the United States had 185,000 soldiers in South Vietnam. At that point, combat deaths were still less than 2,000, a figure that was about to change in a big way. It's very hard to describe the war itself. It's not like World War II with with a clear front, clear boundary lines. What were the armies trying to do? The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were basically just trying to drag things out as long as possible until America decides to go home. Not too different from George Washington in the American Revolution. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, what do? You avoid big confrontations and you try to just string it out and make things so painful for your much bigger opponent that they finally have had enough. So, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese avoided big battles as best they could. They relied on surprise attacks, booby traps. They would infiltrate to get close to military bases, fire off a few rockets, and take off. The U.S. had an awful lot of men there, but the number of combat troops was actually just a fraction of the total American support. American soldiers in Vietnam had, on the bases, they had all the comforts of home. There were all kinds of recreational facilities, food from America, movies. There was an awful lot of support for the men who actually went into the field. How did the Americans try to fight the war? They would send patrols out into the jungle looking for the Viet Cong. Would be search and destroy missions. The platoon goes out, they get dropped off by helicopter, they go into the jungle, they try to find hidden camps of the Viet Cong. They set ambushes and hope that the Viet Cong come along. If the Viet Cong do, they call in the helicopters for more firepower. And what you find is Americans, you lose a lot of American soldiers to the mines and the traps in the jungle. And you kill a lot of civilians that way when you call in the helicopters and when you drop rockets and you drop napalm. The soldiers' experience, must have just been a nightmare. You read some very vivid accounts. This just a couple of quotes that I have found. One fellow said, "You go out on patrol maybe 20 times or more, and nothing, just nothing. And then the 21st time, zap, 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 you get hit." You go out, you're looking, you don't know, nothing happens, and then another fellow said, "The purpose was for you to walk up to Charlie," the communists, "walk up to Charlie and for him to hit you, and then for our hardware to wipe them out. That was all we were, bait. They couldn't find Charlie any other way." You send American troops out into the jungle, you almost hope they get attacked, because then you have a target. You can call in the helicopters to fire some missiles to try to get them. What a way to fight. And the war, this, of course, is a war that's being fought by the working class and racial minorities. Draft deferments protected men in college and graduate school. More than half the men eligible for the draft had a deferment. The Army was 25% from poor families, over half from working class families, only 20% from middle class families. And the racial imbalance was pretty remarkable. Blacks were only 11% of the total soldiers in Vietnam, but they were 31% of the infantry units that went out to fight, and they were only 2% of the officers. The escalation continues. That increase that looked big on my previous slide is now dwarfed by what happens in 66 and 67. By the end of 67, America has 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and now 19,000 soldiers have been killed. By that point, the American people, by the end of 67 into 68, it's amazing how divided the American people were becoming. It's almost exactly 1/3. 1/3 of Americans wanted to go for a complete military victory. About 1/3 wanted to work for a negotiated peace, and about 1/3 wanted to get out now, regardless. And then 1968 comes along with a big surprise. On January 30th, 1968, the Communists launched an offensive in honor of the Tet holiday. The Lunar New Year, known as Tet in the Vietnamese calendar, is one of the biggest celebrations in Vietnamese culture. And to honor that holiday, nearly 100,000 North Vietnamese troops attacked about 100 different cities in South Vietnam all at the same time. They have invaded and briefly occupied the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It took weeks to recapture all the cities. And this, the attack at Tet was being covered now by, their good television cameras. They're beaming it back to the United States. Among the coverage is that famous photo that appears on the front page of the New York Times of a South Vietnamese officer executing a Viet Cong person that has been captured in Saigon. That guy's getting killed at that exact second. What was the American response to Tet? Militarily, Tet was actually a bad thing for the North Vietnamese. About 50% of the soldiers involved in the attacks were killed. They suffered huge casualties. But it was a bigger defeat for American morale. On February 27th, Walter Cronkite, who was America's most respected TV journalist at the time, he comes back from visiting Vietnam and he announces, It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. Lyndon Johnson hears that and he says to an aide, "That's it. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Opposition to the war jumped from 24% or so in February to 42% in March. And then, in the middle of March, the New York Times reports that General Westmoreland wants another 200,000 men, on top of the 500,000 he's already got. That would have required a much bigger draft. It would have required calling up the reserves. Johnson, again, faced an excruciating choice about what to do. And on March 31st, 1968, he went on TV to announce a bombing halt above the demilitarized zone to encourage negotiations. And then he ended the speech with an announcement that very few Americans had been anticipating. Oh, well, first of all, I'm sorry. Isn't that a fabulous photo? That's the toll it was taken on him. That's a killer photo. So the speech.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
So I'm going to come back in the last lecture when I talk about the year 1968. We'll come back to the consequences of that, some of the other things that led up to Johnson's decision to pull out, and how we end up with this guy winning the election in 1968. So Richard Nixon comes back from political, I don't know what you could say, but he ran for governor of California in 1962 and lost. And most people assumed Nixon was gone for good, but he had mounted quite an impressive comeback. During the 68 campaign, Nixon told one of his speechwriters, "I've come to the conclusion that there's no way to win the war. But we can't say that, of course. In fact, we have to seem to say the opposite." Nixon's strategy, and it was a pretty smart strategy, really. And it would look smarter if I could push this button. There we go. Nixon's strategy was to wind down the use of American ground troops and rely on American air power. So he pulled out 100,000 men by the end of 1969, with more to come in 70 and 71. And the idea was to bomb the North Vietnamese into accepting better terms. Since the North Vietnamese were sending supplies through Cambodia, in 1969 Nixon started secretly bombing Cambodia. And then in the spring of 1970, when the bombing wasn't enough, he announced that we were sending troops into Cambodia to try to root out the communist supply locations. The invasion of Cambodia triggered the biggest wave of student protests yet, and I'm going to talk more about the anti-war movement next week when I talk about the counterculture, but the Cambodian invasion led directly to protests on hundreds of campuses. Would you believe 450 American colleges shut down in the spring of 1970? There were just like no final exams. They were around-the-clock meetings of speech, meetings with faculty and students, and the colleges closed. The National Guard went to 21 campuses to try to keep order, and on 2 of them, people were killed. 4 at Kent State and 2 at Jackson State. Nearly 60% of Americans blamed the students at Kent State for them being shot. It took a couple of years, but in early 1973, Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, reached a deal with North Vietnam. And the deal was pretty simple. The United States was going to withdraw all its troops within 60 days. North Vietnam was going to release American POWs, and the people of South Vietnam would be free to decide their own future. Now that sounds sort of good, except the ceasefire left 150,000 communist troops sitting in South Vietnam, ready to keep fighting. No one could call this a victory for the United States. We got out and left the South Vietnamese government to its fate. And although the U.S. continued to supply military aid to the South Vietnamese government, Democrats in Congress drastically cut back how much aid there was going to be. The South Vietnamese government's days were numbered, and it was in May of 1975 that communists finally marched in and captured Saigon, which is now known as Ho Chi Minh City. The cost of the Vietnam War, you can measure it in lots of different ways. In terms of people, 58,000 plus American soldiers killed, about 150,000 wounded. As usual, it's like Korea, and many other wars, particularly Korea. It's the opposing, because of American firepower, we are able to kill a lot more people on the other side than they kill of us. So the opposing forces lost a lot of folks. And naturally, when you're doing all that bombing and napalming, a lot of civilians get killed too. And so you can see the estimated deaths are pretty staggering for the civilians too. All told, about $140 billion of American aid went to South Vietnam over the course of like 20 years. I don't know what that would be in today's dollars, but it would be a lot. And just one final thing to try to prevent this from happening again. And remember, all that I've talked about happened without a declaration of war in the traditional sense. Johnson did all that repelling aggression as authorized by the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is a bit of a stretch. So Congress in 1973 passed the War Powers Act. This was a sort of Democrats in Congress attempt to prevent it from happening again. The president has to disclose the use of American troops within just 48 hours, and the president has to bring them home within 2 months unless Congress authorizes further action. The War Powers Act is still on the books. There are some scholars who question whether it's constitutional, whether putting these conditions on what the president can do improperly interferes with the president's powers as commander-in-chief. But so far it hasn't been tested at the Supreme Court level. It will be interesting to see, this is, if we invade Venezuela anytime soon, it will be interesting to see whether the current president brings the guys back within 60 days or not, or decides that the War Powers Act doesn't apply to him. Maybe none of that will happen, but I don't know. I guess we should all wait and see. In any event, thank you for listening. That's my talk about Vietnam. Next Wednesday, we'll talk about the counterculture. Hippies, lots of hippies. Okay, so anyway, thank you all.